Marvel vs. DC is one of the most famous business rivalries of all time. It's been pretty intense. First off, can we just agree that these are the all-time biggest publishers of comic books? The majority of sales come from one of the two, typically with Marvel being ahead, and that's the way it's been for decades. These two are the creators of practically any superhero character you can name, and logically, almost every popular superhero movie comes from one of those properties. Now, it has been such a long-running feud that there's almost too much that can be compared, both financially and creatively. So to narrow that down for this video, I've chosen to highlight 5 separate times where the rivalries heated up and the companies were greatly impacted by each other. And I should mention that I've already made a video that focuses entirely on Marvel, so to avoid repeating things, I'm going to veer the focus of this one a little more toward DC, and I think that the perfect place to start would be with the formation. I think it's safe to say that Marvel Comics would have never existed if not for DC. In 1934, Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson started a company called National Allied Publications that after a series of name changes would eventually become DC Comics. Within that first year, he put out an oversized comic magazine called New Fun. It stood out from the others because at the time, comic books almost always featured strips that were previously printed in newspapers, whereas New Fun was all original content. In 1937, he joined together with a publisher named Harry Donenfeld and his accountant named Jack Leibowitz to create a separate company called Detective Comics that would produce a series of comics under that same name. Wheeler Nicholson sold his share of everything about a year later, which was unfortunate timing because June of 1938 is when they launched their action comic series that changed the comic book industry forever. See, back in the early 1930s, as teenagers, writer Jerry Siegel and illustrator Joe Shuster self-published a comic called The Reign of the Superman. I'm sorry to spoil it, but it's about a homeless person who takes a drug that gives him telepathy powers. He uses them for evil before turning back to his normal self. Not quite the Superman we recognize today. He was essentially the villain of the story, and he was also bald, looking a lot more like Lex Luthor than anything else. But over the next few years, he was shaped into the character that we all know, and National Allied Publications paid Siegel and Shuster $130 for the exclusive rights to it, and he was featured on the cover of the now famous Action Comics #1. That issue was like the spark that ignited people's interest in superheroes and comic books in general. In May of 1939, the 27th issue of the Detective Comics series included the first appearance of Batman, and obviously by that point, DC Comics was becoming well established. And all of that happened, by the way, before Marvel ever put out their first comic. In short, the success that DC was having with comic books made many others want to start producing them as well. One of these people was Martin Goodman, who teamed up with a company called Funnies Inc. to publish Marvel Comics #1, released in August of 1939, and it was so successful that it motivated him to form an entire comic book company. That company would also go through a series of complex naming changes before ultimately becoming Marvel. Speaking of the name Marvel, it's going to get a little bit tricky when I talk about the next thing on my list, Captain Marvel. In the 1940s, arguably the most popular superhero was Captain Marvel, and I'm not talking about the Brie Larson character that you see in the MCU, I'm talking about something entirely different. As I said, Marvel was only one of many companies looking to take advantage of the emerging comic book markets. Another big example would be Fawcett Publications, who created Captain Marvel to be featured in their newly created Whiz comic series in 1940. It got so popular that Adventures of Captain Marvel, released the following year, is credited with being the first ever superhero movie adapted from a comic book, an industry that has obviously exploded, so that's something notable. The character himself was a child that would turn into a superhero after saying the word Shazam, and once he was in that form, he was very much like Superman in that he could fly and had super strength and everything else. In fact, he was so much like Superman that DC filed a lawsuit against them, where as part of the settlement in 1953, Fawcett agreed to stop publishing the comics. So then, over a decade later, since it hadn't been used in so long, Marvel was able to obtain the trademark to the name and use it in their comics. I know it's getting kind of tricky. Well, things get even more complicated in the 1970s, when Fawcett licensed the rights to that original Captain Marvel character to DC. However, since there was a whole naming issue at that point, he basically started going by the name Shazam instead. And I think this all nicely comes together in 2019, where within a month of each other, Marvel and DC both released movies centered around these competing characters. Alright, my next example of the rivalry takes place in the 1960s with an iconic team of superheroes called the Justice League. See, the previous decade was tough for comic books. Once World War II ended, most of the public wasn't responding to the superheroes in the same way. It motivated both Marvel and DC and many of the others to expand heavily into other genres, such as Western, science fiction, and horror. And some of those horror comics did get pretty graphic. It led to this massive backlash against comic books, where many of the parents didn't want the kids reading them, and then Congress got involved. It led to the Comics Code Authority to avoid government involvement. It was all a mess, and it caused comic book sales specifically for Marvel to go way down. In 1960, DC brought back an old property called the Justice Society of America and updated them as the Justice League of America. Honestly, I don't know why it took so long for it to happen. It essentially grouped together all of their most popular superheroes into one series, and of course, it did really well and even helped to revive comic books. The story goes that Martin Goodman from Marvel again saw the success of what DC was doing and set out to replicate it. He told Jack Kirby and Stan Lee to create something involving a team of superheroes. They got together, and the result was the Fantastic Four that debuted the following year. Though I do want to emphasize that the fact that it was a group of superheroes wasn't the only thing to make it popular. The true genius of the Fantastic Four was that, unlike most of the other superheroes at the time, they weren't perfect. They would fight with each other, and people responded to it because it made them more relatable. That type of character marked the start of something new for Marvel, and it quickly led to many other popular characters like Spider-Man. In fact, unlike DC, most of the Marvel characters that we know today were created after 1960. Though I do admit that the Fantastic Four isn't exactly like the Justice League. To put it in sports terms, the Fantastic Four was like a team, but the Justice League was like an all-star team. But then, of course, Marvel created their own all-star team just 2 years later with the Avengers, that at this point, I think we can say has far surpassed the popularity of the Justice League. By the end of that decade, Marvel was outselling DC, which ironically would not have been the case had DC not created their successful series of the Justice League. It's a definite pattern where DC comes up with a really good idea, and then Marvel somehow, one way or another, ends up benefiting from it even more. My next example is infamous in the comic book world, the DC explosion that quickly led to the DC implosion. Starting in the later part of the 1960s, Marvel was looking to take full advantage of their newfound popularity and basically just started putting out a ton of stuff. I'm talking about more titles, more characters, bigger books at higher prices, and then a few years later, DC took their lead and started doing the same thing, along with introducing a new logo, and by the way, this is when they finally officially became known as DC Comics. It was a risky plan, seemingly put into place to keep up with Marvel, and unfortunately, I don't know if it could have gone any worse. It was bad timing more than anything else. The economy was slow and inflation was out of control, which was obviously not the best time to raise the price of your comics. Not to mention it was costing more money to print them, and on top of that, there were some nasty snowstorms during those winters, meaning fewer people were out at the newsstands or willing to make the trip to the comic book store. They essentially tried to execute this big expansion plan right as sales started to fall. It's now referred to as the implosion because everything was quickly scaled back. Many series were canceled after only a few issues. In fact, they canceled so many series that in the end, they had fewer than they had started with. A notable example would be the effect that it had on Detective Comics. After about 40 years, they almost ended that series, but instead chose to merge it with a different series called The Batman Family, creating these bigger comics, but changed it back after only 15 issues. Overall, a depressing event for DC, but I do find it funny how when DC tried to replicate something from Marvel, it didn't go nearly as well. The final part of the rivalry that I want to talk about brings us into more modern times with the movies. That is the way that both of these companies have become so relevant today. First off, in 1967, DC was bought by the Kinney National Company, who before this was all over the place and operating different businesses, but from this point on, entertainment became their main focus. They bought DC Comics, and then they bought Warner Brothers, and then they sold everything else and changed the name of the overall company to Warner Communications, so that's how Warner came to own DC. And the fact that they have been owned by a major movie studio since the 1960s, I think we can say is the main reason that DC movies had such a head start over Marvel. Consider that by the 1990s, there were already multiple well-known movies starring both Superman and Batman. The Christopher Reeve movie in 1978 was Warner's highest-grossing movie of all time, that was followed by 3 others starring the same character that, in my opinion, become questionable in quality. And then the Michael Keaton Batman in 1989 became Warner's new highest-grossing movie, that was also followed by 3 others starring the same character that, again, in my opinion, become questionable in quality. There was a time where DC had released all of that, and the only live-action Marvel movie was Howard the Duck. But then, of course, they both started putting out some big films in the 2000s, notably the X-Men and Spider-Man series for Marvel and the Dark Knight trilogy for DC. But I do want to point out that those Marvel movies were being made by Fox and Sony, who had bought the movie rights to the characters, meaning that Marvel wasn't benefiting nearly as much. I think we all know that everything changed in 2009 when Disney bought Marvel and started expanding the MCU into the most successful movie series ever. So we now have a situation where both DC and Marvel are owned by a major film studio. To demonstrate how much Marvel has pulled ahead since then, as I make this in 2022, the highest grossing DC film is Aquaman at about $1.1 billion. And there are 8 Marvel movies that have made more money than that, the highest grossing one being Avengers Endgame at almost $2.8 billion. Not to say DC hasn't been successful with their movies, but financially speaking, they're just not keeping up with Marvel. And then you have to think that the DCEU is a response to the success of the MCU, which is kind of weird, right? Back in the 1960s, the Avengers was the response to the Justice League, and now with the movies, it feels like it's the other way around. Let me know in the comments, which side are you on, DC or Marvel? Not that you have to choose a side, but I'll bet that you're probably leaning one way or the other. And before I finish, I should mention Jack Kirby. He's famous for creating and contributing to many Marvel characters, but he did switch over to DC for a time in the 1970s. So that's another notable part of the rivalry, and feel free to mention any other parts of it. For this video, I only selected the 5 that I felt were the most impactful or the most interesting, so there's plenty more to talk about.